Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. My name is TravisShaddox. Thank you for joining me. This channel, we explore how we know what we know about turfgrass science, and this month is Mental Health Awareness Month, and so we're spending some time going over some psychological studies and things like depression and so forth. So that's what we're doing this month, and then we'll get back into the turfgrass literature on the first week in June. Actually, I think it might be the second week in June. I have some family obligations I got to do. But anyway, welcome. I had a good weekend here in Lexington, Kentucky. I hope you did too. I had a 6 or 7 hour bike ride yesterday with my family. That was fun. And now we're back here. It's a beautiful day. It's going to be a good week in Lexington. Sunny, getting warm. We are going to go over some pesticide and depression information in today's episode. So hang out a little bit for that. And at the end, we're going to go over probably my favorite song by my favorite band, I guess. It's hard to say a favorite song. It's like saying your favorite kid. You can't really do that. But certainly one of my favorite songs by one of my favorite bands at the end. The channel is growing. It is also available on podcast platforms. So if you're watching this on YouTube and you're driving or whatever the case is, and you're like, well, I wish it was on a podcast, I do load these to podcasts. It usually is the next day, around 24 hours after the show ends. I strip out the audio and then load it into the podcast platforms. So you can listen to it on podcast the next day. For those of you who join live, of course, you can chit chat with me in the chat if you like, and I'll try to answer any questions that you may have. On the podcasts, we are approaching 10,000 downloads. Probably by Thursday night's show this week, we'll be at 10,000 downloads. And the YouTube channel is well over 100,000 views. I know it's still a very small channel, but we're making progress. We're doing our best to communicate the evidence. Hopefully you all can use it and, avoid some pitfalls in the turfgrass industry when it comes to spending money on things you don't need to. But for today, we're getting into the pesticide application. So the link between pesticide applications and depression is fairly strong. There is a fair amount of evidence there. We're going to go over that today. But before we get too far down that, let me just say that pesticides, the application of pesticides, if performed properly, the risk is very low. Okay, so I don't want anybody to have any sort of misconception that, Shaddox is going over articles that, denigrate pesticides. No, pesticides are very useful. There's a reason why we can grow as much food as we do on the acres that we do. But you need to be responsible. You need to, use proper personal protective equipment and so forth. Okay. And one thing I'd like to say before I get into it is throughout my experience in my career, I have very little. I'm not an expert in pesticides, nor am I an expert in personal protective equipment and all things go along with it. But I have been privileged to sit and listen to people who are experts in that area, and pretty much across the board, one thing that seems to be consistent among those specialists when they give a talk about pesticide exposure is there is an unfortunately large percentage of applicators who sometimes believe that using personal protective equipment is confined to the application of the pesticide as opposed to the entire exposure event. So let me explain what I mean by that. The actual application of the pesticide itself is an opportunity for exposure, right? But it doesn't seem to be, at least my understanding is, it doesn't seem to be as large a priority or as a large of a potential exposure event as is the actual mixing and blending and cleaning of the equipment and so forth before and after the actual application occurs. So if you can envision, you have everything mixed up and you're spraying it, and you have your PPE on, the personal protective equipment on, and you're spraying it and you're going across the turf or whatever the case is, the chance of exposure is whatever it is. But when you're actually blending it and mixing it in the tank, when you're pouring things out of the jug and so forth, mistakes can happen. So for example, if you happen to be using pressurized equipment and everything's mixed up and is pressurized, but then, for example, you might attach the output hose after the tank's pressurized, you can have an acute event, pesticide exposure event, where the pesticide actually sprays up on your hands or, God forbid, your face or something, while you're actually blending it. You're not even applying it yet. And there's many, many examples I'm sure all you can have of that, where you may be blending it and it spills out on your hand or whatever the case is, because that's when you have the largest exposure to concentrated pesticides, right? And there's a lot of error involved and mistakes that can happen during that process. So it's critically important, I guess where I'm going with this is it's critically important to wear your personal protective equipment before you even start handling the product. Put it all on, okay? Be extra safe. Even when you're mixing it, have gloves on, even when you're using just herbicides or something and it's very diluted and so forth, just wear all your equipment and avoid any potential exposure, or at least minimize all the exposure that you may come into contact with, particularly face shields. When you're blending, things can splash up. You're pouring water in a tank and things can splash off of that and come into contact with, your eyes or your mouth and things like that. It's just best to wear all that. And it's so don't avoid, I guess what I'm saying is don't avoid the pre and post application exposure events that can occur. Don't just think of it as I'm putting it on when I'm spraying it, okay? I just want to make sure we're all aware of that. And I know we are, but please don't forget about that opportunity for exposure. It's very great, very great. It can occur. So let's get into this article. This article is going to be talking about pesticide exposure and depression. The title of the article is, let me get my stuff ready, is Depression and Pesticide Exposure Among Private Pesticide Applicators Enrolled in the Agricultural Health Study. This was published in the Journal of Environmental Health Perspectives, which has an impact factor of around 10 or 11, I think, which is decent for a medical journal. This is published by a handful of authors. I'm going to try to pronounce these names. Beseler, Stallones, Hoppin, Alavanja, Blair, Keefe, and Kamel. I don't know how to pronounce their last name there. And they were in Nebraska and Colorado and a variety of different locations. This is a rather robust study, and I learned a lot by reading it. And I actually had to have my wife help explain the statistics to me because they use an odd, for an agricultural work, it's an odd statistic that they use, and I wanted to make sure I had at least a basic understanding of what it meant and how to interpret the results. So I'm gonna do my best, but keep in mind I don't deal with the odds ratio in agriculture very often, and I've never dealt with it, and I'm not that familiar with it. So I'll do my best to do it justice, the paper and the statistics. Okay, here we go. The introduction. Recent reviews have noted neurological sequelae, which is like what can happen. A sequelae is a condition that can occur after you have something, or you've already got, some disease or illness, and then something can occur as a result of that. Recent reviews have noted neurological sequelae of pesticide exposure among farmers, and in the past decade, strong associations have been reported between high-level occupational exposure to pesticides and an increased risk of depression. In an Egyptian population, the frequency of depressive neurosis was significantly higher in male pesticide formulators with at least 15 years of pesticide exposure compared with matched controls. In the same study, severe depression scores from the General Health Questionnaire were significantly higher in male pesticide applicators than in their non-exposed controls, matched on age, socioeconomic status, and educational level. The exposure considered were primarily carbamates, pyrethroids, and organophosphates applied to cornfields, Although pesticide poisoning was not reported, the investigation noted that safety measures were poor in this study population. So that particular study was in Egypt, and they concluded there was an association. A number of studies have shown long-term depression as a sequelae of an acute pesticide poisoning. Having experienced a pesticide-related illness was significantly associated with depression measured using the Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale in 761 Colorado farm residents. In 52 tobacco farmers in southern Brazil who were applying organophosphates, 13 reported a history of poisoning. The number of individuals with depression or anxiety disorders was significantly greater than expected, but declined after 3 months without organophosphate exposure. We're actually going to they're going to show differences between the impact of different pesticides as well in this study, organophosphates, organochlorines, and so forth. The purpose of the present study was to evaluate the relationship between pesticide exposure and physician-diagnosed depression in a cohort of farmer applicators enrolled in the agricultural health study. So you're going to learn real quickly my limits of statistical knowledge when it comes to this, okay? I don't have a lot of statistical knowledge in medicine. I have none in medicine whatsoever. So I learned a lot. I enjoyed reading this paper. It was a little bit cumbersome for me because I don't know that language very well. But after some consultation with my wife, who does deal with the odds ratio, she helped me kind of orient myself a little bit. And I do feel much better about communicating the results accurately to you all. But I enjoyed reading the paper. It was very interesting. They did a extremely robust and good analysis of the data and had a number of covariants that they accounted for and they adjusted for and so forth. It was impressive, I thought. The materials and methods. So when I say the AHS, it's the Agricultural Health Study. So the AHS cohort included 89,000 individuals, 5,000 commercial applicators, and 52,000 private applicators, and 32,000 spouses of private applicators who were recruited in Iowa and North Carolina from 93 to 97, and who are being followed to assess a variety of health outcomes. The present analysis was restricted to private applicators who were primarily farmers. So that's the manner in which they sectioned it off or partitioned the population. Just private applicators who were primarily farmers were included in this study. The current study is a cross-sectional analysis of baseline data from the ongoing cohort studies. So for that, if you're not familiar with that language, so cross-sectional essentially means that they looked at this time frame across these variables, whereas a longitudinal study would be that same sort of analysis across these variables, but over time. So for example, in turfgrass, if we measured it this way, we didn't run the analysis this way, but the survey of golf course superintendents' nutrient usage or water usage and so forth, that the GCSA and NGF investigate and survey and then published every 5 or 10 years now. They started doing that in 2004, I think it was, 2004, 2005, something like that. And they've been doing it occasionally ever since. And so the first study would have been a cross-sectional study, but every study after that, although it wasn't analyzed as a longitudinal study, they could have been analyzed as a longitudinal study because they were measured over many years of the same population. So that's the difference between cross-sectional analysis and a longitudinal analysis for those people who might not be familiar with it. All applicators completed the questionnaire at enrollment, and 44% or 23,000 completed a supplemental questionnaire at home. Together, the questionnaires provided detailed information on physician-diagnosed depression, pesticide use, and covariates, including race, ethnicity, education, marital status, medical condition, alcohol use, and smoking habits. We're going to find something very funny about the alcohol use. When you run so many analyses and so many survey, and you start comparing all these things, sometimes really funny things can pop out. It doesn't necessarily mean that this caused that, but it's interesting to see what is associated with what. And sometimes it's just complete. There's obviously no association in reality, but the statistics show there's an association. So, for example, I did a episode on this months and months ago about the difference between correlation and causation. And there's a very strong correlation between eating ice cream and deaths due to swimming. Obviously, eating ice cream doesn't cause deaths due to swimming, but because those two things happen to occur at the same time of year, there's a very good correlation. So we're going to find something very funny when it comes to alcohol use. I thought it was funny. Information on physician-diagnosed depression and physician-diagnosed pesticide poisoning was requested only in the supplemental questionnaire. So we included only those applicators who completed the latter in the present analysis. Cases were defined as farmer applicators who responded yes to the question, has a doctor ever told you that you had been diagnosed with depression requiring medication or shock therapy? Those responding yes were asked about their age at diagnosis in 4 categories: less than 20, 20 to 39, 40 to 59, and greater than 59 years. Controls were farmer applicators who had not been diagnosed with depression. To reduce potential misclassification, 848 individuals who reported feeling depressed, indifferent, or withdrawn once a week or more during the year prior to enrollment, but had not been diagnosed with depression, were excluded from the control group. So in other words, even if they weren't clinically diagnosed, but they gave an indication on the questionnaire that there may be something going on neurological with that particular person, they went ahead and excluded them from the control group to maintain some purity in the control group or some confidence that the control group was in fact not depressed, even if they weren't diagnosed depressed. So they excluded anybody that might have been depressed from the control group. Cumulative exposure to any pesticide was categorized in 3 groups based upon the distribution of lifetime application days. The latter was calculated as the average number of days per year the applicator mixed or applied any pesticide, asked in 6 categories, multiplied by the number of years of pesticide use, asked in 7 categories, using the midpoint of the categories. The low exposure group, which was the reference group, had used pesticides less than 226 days. The intermediate exposure group reported 226 to 752 days. And the high exposure group reported greater than 752 days of use. Okay. The questionnaires also collected detailed information on the lifetime use of 50 pesticides, 22 on the enrollment questionnaire, and 28 on the supplemental questionnaire. And these included things like insecticide, fungicides, fumigants, herbicides, and so forth. And the groups were analyzed as organophosphates such as malathion, parathion, and so forth, carbamates such as carbaryl, which was 7, aldicarb, and organochlorines, which is DDT, chlordane, etc. Just a little word to the wise. Might want to avoid organochlorines. Chlordane was not outlawed, but I mean, it was removed by the EPA in 1983, I think it was. And then it was completely abandoned and banned in the United States, I want to say in 1985. And a little anecdote on that, there was a turf thought I gave a couple weeks ago about a Grandpa Alfred, right? Well, my Grandpa Alfred actually did, unfortunately, die from what was very likely acute pesticide poisoning from mixing pesticides in the tank with a wooden spoon. That was not made up. That actually did happen. And I called my uncle, who in the 50s helped Grandpa Alfred spray. And I asked him, what pesticide were you guys using? And he said he couldn't remember, but they were spraying it on aphids on alfalfa. And when you look that up, back then in the 40s, early 40s, and into the 50s, DDT was used for that. But in the 50s, chlordane was also commonly used in some of those applications. So, in essence, what I'm getting at is my great-grandfather very likely passed away from acute DDT toxicity or possibly chlordane. But we don't know because we don't have any. We don't know. The only person who would know is my uncle, and he doesn't remember. So might want to avoid organochlorines. This was actually, organochlorines, if I'm not mistaken, was actually a category of pesticides that was either created or discovered or at least enhanced by someone who also resulted in the greatest increase in human population, which was Fritz Haber. So Fritz Haber was a master of the chlorine molecule in Germany, and he was involved with the use of chlorine as a pesticide in things like what was the? It was, I can't remember the name of the pesticide now. I can't remember the name of the pesticide now. But anyway, I'm pretty sure that was an evolution, that organochlorines evolved from his work. I may be wrong on that. Someone can point it out. Unfortunately, the Nazis took his work with chlorines for pesticide use and converted that into a chlorine that was used to massacre people in the gas chambers. And so Fritz Haber was single-handedly, well, not single-handedly, but he was highly responsible for the death of millions of people. But on the contrary, he was also responsible for the lives of billions of people through his invention of the Haber-Bosch process, and which is the process that we use to generate nitrogen fertilizer from air, and that's what grows plants and feeds the world and so forth. So it's a really strange juxtaposition there between the same person that invented, chlorines that killed people, also invented the nitrogen process that grew food to help people. Anyway, organochlorines, avoid them. Let's move on. We selected covariates evaluated in univariate logistic regression models based on previous studies of pesticides or depression, and included age, state of resident, high school education, Hispanic ethnicity, marital status, smoking behavior, alcohol use, frequency of visits to a doctor in the past year, farms with no crops or animals, working a job off the farm, number of years lived or worked on a farm, and use of personal protective equipment, PPE. So those were the covariates that they used in their analysis. We used univariate and multivariable models to evaluate associations of depression with cumulative exposure to any pesticide or with functional pesticide groups. To separate the effects of cumulative lifetime exposure from those of high exposure, we ran 3 multivariate models, which I'm not going to go into all that, but you're welcome to read it. Results are reported as an odds ratio with 95% confidence intervals, which I'm going to explain a little bit, but please bear with me. I'm not a statistician, particularly in this world. I'll do my best to explain sort of what it means if you choose to go through this paper and read it on your own. It might help you. We used this 2nd of August 2002 release of the AHS Phase 1 data for all analysis. This work was conducted with the approval of the Institutional Review Boards of Colorado State University and the National Institute of Environmental Health and Sciences and the National Cancer Institute. All study participants gave written informed consent prior to the study. So the reason I highlighted that is some people might not be familiar with what the IRB, the Institutional Review Boards, but when we deal with plants in turf and whatever, we can kind of go out within some boundaries and do, studies on our own. I mean, we don't need a review board to review all the treatments and make sure we're doing everything appropriately because we don't have people involved that could be harmed as a result of one of our treatments, right? But when you're dealing with human studies and human trials, they're to do it correctly, you must have an IRB, an institutional review board, authorize it or review it. In this case, they had that. They had the National Institute of Environmental Health and Sciences review it. So this is a very robust and properly reviewed and evaluated study, is the reason I highlighted that. Okay. On to the results. In this study population, 3% reported a physician-diagnosed depression. Prevalence was similar in North Carolina and in Iowa. We compared demographic characteristics between cases and controls and those with complete data for all covariates. Race and ethnicity did not differ between cases and controls, but there were very few non-whites or Hispanics in the study population. So a lot of white people. Cases were more likely than controls to be older, be unmarried, have more visits to the doctor, be past smokers, consume alcohol less frequently, have ever worked off the farm and presently lived on a farm with no crops or animals, but there were no differences between cases and controls in the lifetime number of years lived or worked on a farm. The use of personal protective equipment for pesticide application did not differ between the cases and the controls. Okay? So this Table 1, I'm not going to show anything really in this Table 1 because this is not adjusted for the covariates. This is just, I guess, the data. It says demographic, behavioral, medical, and farm characteristics and exposure differences between depression cases and controls in Iowa and North Carolina. But I'm not going to show this because it's not adjusted. They have another table that is adjusted, and I'm going to show the data really from that. So I don't really see any point in showing this because they didn't adjust it. So when they say adjusted, what they're saying is that they're accounting for a confounding factor in, say, age or sex or location they lived or smoking or drinking or whatever that could have altered the data. So, or basically anything they asked for, they can account for how those variables may have biased the data or altered the data, and they adjust for that. And then later, what they're going to show is that there's limitations because they didn't account for every possible known variable, and some of those variables could have altered the data. It's very possible, but they account for those limitations at the end of the study, or they don't account for them. They explain them and then they present them. These are limitations. Okay. So they're going to start talking about the odds ratio here. Significantly increased odds of depression were observed for individuals who reported the high pesticide exposure event and those with a history of pesticide poisoning. So let me explain the odds ratio real quick. Actually, you know what? Let me show it on this table, I guess, which I wasn't going to use. But let me show it here just for a second. So the odds ratio you can kind of see it over here. You're going to see the cases, the controls, and then over here you're going to see this OR 95% confidence interval. And the odds ratio is this 0.89, and then the confidence interval is 0.73 to 1.03 for this variable of state of residence between Iowa and North Carolina. So the odds ratio essentially says this: if the odds ratio is 1, then there's no association, or there's no one factor doesn't influence the other. So if they were in North Carolina, or they didn't affect it versus Iowa, okay? However, if the odds ratio goes up above 1, then factor A is influencing factor B, or factor A is influenced by factor B. And if it's below 1, then factor B is influenced by factor A, and that's how it works. However, we also want to look at the confidence interval. If the confidence interval, which is in this case is 0.7 to 1.1 basically, if the confidence interval includes 1, then what that means is the value or the point at which the two variables would be known to not have any impact on the other, one variable would have no impact on the other, is included in the 95% confidence interval. And therefore, they wouldn't likely conclude that one is influencing the other. Where I'm going with that is the 95% confidence interval must not include the number 1. It must be greater than number 1. I guess it could be less than number 1. And then, if that's the case, then you can look at the odds ratio if it's less than 1 or if it's greater than 1 to determine if one factor is influencing the other. That's the way you want to look at odds ratios. It's my understanding, at least. I'm sure statisticians throwing a fit over my explanation, but feel free to put a note in the chat and I'll pin it, or however I can do that, so we make sure it's clear how to read that. The median lifetime days of pesticide exposure was significantly higher in both those who reported a high pesticide exposure event and those who reported a history of pesticide poisoning, compared with those who did not report either of these events. Table 2, this is what I'm going to actually show. Table 2 presents multivariable logistic regression of factors showing a significant relationship with depression in the univariate analysis. So this Table 2 is actually going to adjust for the covariates. And that's, in my opinion, or my understanding is that's the one that we'd have greater confidence in because it's accounting for some of the other variables or all the other variables. After excluding those with a high pesticide exposure event, excluding those that have pesticide poisoning or both, the highest level of lifetime days, which was greater than 752, showed a statistically significant relationship to diagnosed depression. So what they're saying is, down here in this table where it says lifetime days of exposure greater than 752, if we look over here at this table, I'm looking for those listening, I'm looking at model 1, 2, 3, and 4. Model 1 is all the samples, including those that had a high pesticide exposure event and including those that had a diagnosis of pesticide poisoning. Model 2 is excluding the high pesticide exposure event. Number 3 is excluding the diagnosed poisoning. And number 4 is excluding both high pesticide exposure event and poisoning. So in other words, model 4 is simply looking at the population that applies pesticides normally and has never had a high exposure event like pesticides splashing in your face, or has never actually had a diagnosis of pesticide poisoning by a physician. Okay? So we're looking at model 4. And in model 4, lifetime days of pesticide exposure greater than 752, we notice the odds ratio is 1.54, and the lower limit of the 95% confidence interval is greater than 1. This is the reason why they're saying up here that there was a statistically significant relationship to diagnosed depression among those who have a lifetime application days or exposure days greater than 752. So what this means is very, very long-term usage of pesticides greater than 752 is associated with increased depression, diagnosis of depression. Okay? Ever having used insecticides, that's table 4. I'm going to go to that in a second. But before I go to that, I'm going to show you what I think is funny. So the table 2 is really where you want to spend a lot of your time here, except for table 4, which talks about the pesticide use and types. But visits to the doctor, more than one visit to the doctor was a 5 on the odds ratio with the 95% confidence interval, the lower limit being at 3.7. So this means that there's a very strong relationship, I guess, of going to the doctor more than once a year and having pesticide or having depression. But they're going to explain that they can't really make that connection in the conclusions. They're going to discuss and explain why they can't. They're not saying that going to the doctor results in depression, and they're going to explain why that is in this particular example. But look here at the alcohol use in the past year. It's great. Alcohol use in the past year for the total sample. If you've never used any alcohol in the past year, the odds ratio was 1.4 and the 95% confidence interval was greater than 1. It was totally greater than 1. But then if you use less than 3, the odds ratio goes down to 1.3. And if you use almost every day, the odds ratio goes down even to 1.29. And the everyday alcohol use, it includes 1 in the confidence interval. So what the saying is that the more alcohol you use, the less likely you're going to be depressed. I mean, that's fantastic. So strange stuff like that happens. And they didn't discuss that. They didn't go into an explanation or attempt to explain why that might occur. I just thought that was funny. So if you don't use any alcohol, what this is saying, if you just looked at it in a vacuum, it would say you need to drink alcohol to not be depressed if you're applying pesticides, which is probably true for a lot of people. All right, we go on. Ever having used insecticides, organophosphates, or organochlorines was significantly associated with diagnosed depression in both unadjusted and adjusted models. Here, and then this red thing I've highlighted here, stepwise logistical regression. So what is a stepwise logistical regression? In studies like this where they have a lot of variables and they do a covariant analysis, you can conduct what's called a stepwise logistical regression. And what that does is it throws everything into a model, all the variables into a model, and based upon their influence, okay, the stepwise logistical regression will tell you which of the variables is most likely resulting in depression in this case or whatever. And it can give you the probability or the likelihood that this particular variable is the most influencing variable. stepwise logistical regression selected ever use of organophosphates and ever use of organochlorines to be significant predictors of depression in the unadjusted model and in the adjusted model. Okay, so let's look at table 4 before we go to the discussion. I don't know if I can't get this all on the screen, but you guys can see it where it is. The unadjusted and adjusted odds ratio from logistical regression models of diagnosed depression for specific classes of pesticides. And this is what they're talking about. If you've ever used an insecticide, whether it was adjusted or not adjusted, you can see the odds ratio is a 2, with the confidence interval be not including 1 if it was unadjusted. And if it was adjusted, it was also a 2. Whereas if you used herbicides, it was a 2, but it included, the 95% interval included 1 in the unadjusted model, as well as it included 1 in the adjusted model. So what does that mean? That means that because the 95% confidence interval included 1, they can't say with a lot of confidence that, in fact, using herbicides was associated with depression. But you can say that for sure with insecticides from this study. And that's one reason I've said for ages and ages and ages, I wear a PPE regardless of what I'm applying, whether it's Roundup or whatever. It could be, a Celeprint. It could be it was super safe products. I still wear more PPE than was really even required. Just because it's like, why risk it? It doesn't cost me hardly anything to use the PPE, use it correctly. There can be a limit where if you're putting on so much PPE and it's 95 degrees in the middle of August and you're suffering potentially from heat stress, heat stroke, there can be a limit where you're harming yourself the opposite direction. But within reason, I try to use all the PPE that I have available, even, to protect myself. But one thing I've said for ages is that I'm not overly concerned about herbicides, even though I still wear the PPE, as I am with insecticides. Why? Well, there's more data than just what I'm showing here and other work, but herbicides are in a different family. They're in the plant family, whereas insecticides are in the animal kingdom. Okay? I should say the Plantae kingdom. So when you're dealing with insecticides, you're dealing with trying to control an organism that is an animal, just like I am. Whereas when you're dealing with plants, it's a different kingdom. When you're dealing with fungi, it's a different kingdom, and it's a little bit less, at least from what I understand, it's a little bit less concerning, I guess, or less of a potential for acute toxicity in these things with these other pesticides. Keep in mind, I still wear PPE regardless. Okay, I'm not avoiding it. I'm not. Oh, I'm only applying herbicides, so I'm not going to wear my PPE. No, I don't do that. I don't recommend you do that. I recommend you wear PPE regardless. But one reason why I'm overly cautious with insecticides, I look like I'm an astronaut out there spraying when I'm messing with insecticides, is because of stuff like this. It shows right here, objectively, that there is a much greater chance or probability that they're associated with depression, insecticides, than are herbicides, than are fungicides. Okay, fungicides are 1.2 if the adjusted, and 1.1 with the unadjusted. The unadjusted does not contain the number 1. I'm sorry, the unadjusted does contain the 1 in the 95% confidence interval. And the adjusted, it's 1.01, so essentially there's very little confidence you'd have in fungicides. Okay, but insecticides, you don't want to mess with them. You don't want to mess with any of these, but certainly not insecticides. And then look at organophosphates. Organophosphates for the adjusted model, which is probably where you want to spend the majority of your interest, is 1.8. And the confidence interval, the lowest limit, is 1.27. So in other words, there's a pretty good confidence that there's an association between the use of organophosphates and clinically diagnosed depression. And the use of organochlorines is greater at 1.32. I'm sorry, no. Is less at 1.32. Less. And the 95% confidence interval does not contain 1. Meaning that there's good confidence that both organochlorines and organophosphates are associated with clinically diagnosed depression. The use of those products can result in clinically diagnosed depression. So don't play around with either of those classes of insecticides. Don't play around with any pesticide. Always wear your equipment. Even if you think, I'm just mixing up a 1 gallon container of Roundup, just do it. Okay. Just, there's no sense in risking it. It's your own well-being. It's your own health. Wear the proper equipment. Protect yourself. All right. Where was I? Okay. Discussion. In the present study, depression was associated with a history of pesticide poisoning or a high exposure event after adjusting for important covariates. It's that simple. In addition, after excluding subjects with high pesticide exposure events or poisoning, high cumulative pesticide exposure was significantly associated with diagnosed depression. We observed similar results when subjects with depressive symptoms were included in the control group. These findings extend previous report where symptoms of anxiety and depression were reported in pesticide-poisoned individuals, and they have a number of citations for that. In the present study, ever having used insecticides, organophosphates, or organochlorines was significantly associated with diagnosed depression. Long-term exposure to DDT has been associated with an increase in psychiatric symptoms. DDT alone, they have a citation for that. DDT alone was not significantly associated with depression in this farming population in the univariate or adjusted models. Carbamates were not associated with depression, indicating that the rapid reactivation of acetylcholinesterase after carbamate inhibition may reduce the risk of depression, or an altogether different mechanism may explain the association of organophosphates and depression in previous studies and in the current one. Genetic susceptibility may play a role in the association of depression with pesticide exposure. Those with a personal or family history of affective disorders may be at an increased risk of depression when exposed to acetylcholinesterase inhibiting organophosphates. So then they go into a little bit of deeper explanation as to the potential influence of genetics. You may just be genetically predisposed to having more sensitivity to those types of products. Okay? Coming down to the end here. Those visiting a doctor at least 2 times during the past year showed twice the odds of being diagnosed with depression compared with those with only 1 visit. Now they're going to explain here why you can't really make that connection that going to the doctor resulted in depression. And so they're going to explain this. This agrees with previous studies showing that a greater number of visits to a doctor increase the chances of being diagnosed with depression. Conversely, those who are depressed may visit a doctor more often. So if you're sick, you're probably going to the doctor more. You're going to be more likely to be diagnosed with some sort of ailment if you're going to the doctor and getting checked because you feel ill than if you don't. Okay? To examine importance of this reciprocal relationship, we stratified the analysis by number of doctor visits and found that although a history of pesticide poisoning was 2-fold greater in those without a doctor visit in the past year compared with those with 1 or more visits, pesticide poisoning was the most important predictor of depression in both strata of doctor visits. So in other words, they drilled into the data deeper, and after they were doing that, they determined that it was the pesticide exposure events or pesticide poisoning was more important than the actual doctor's visits in that population. Because of the lack of adequate temporal information, it can only be concluded that the relationship between a history of pesticide poisoning and diagnosed depression was not a function of the number of doctor's visits in the year preceding the enrollment in this study. The strengths of this, and they talk about a lot about the limitations of this study. We're going to go into that a little bit here in just a second. The strengths of this study include the large number of cases of self-reported physician-diagnosed depression, a detailed questionnaire containing information on pesticide use history and other risk factors for depression, a gradation of exposure levels, and controls drawn from the same population as cases, which minimizes the potential confounding factors. A limitation is that information on diagnosed depression and pesticide exposure was collected cross-sectionally, and both were self-reported. So in other words, they just took a snapshot in time and it was self-reported. Okay? That's a limitation, as they note. Additionally, age at diagnosis of depression and age at pesticide poisoning were asked in 20-year age categories, and no specific dates were available for either diagnosis. It is possible that depression could increase the probability of high pesticide exposure events or pesticide poisoning. However, of the 33 individuals who had both a diagnosis of pesticide poisoning and depression, and provided information on the age category when these diagnoses occurred, only one individual reported depression prior to pesticide poisoning. A further limitation is that data on some potential confounding factors such as financial information, including income and debt, and indicators of social support were not available. These factors could be related to the stress in the study participants, which may increase the probability of having pesticide poisoning and may also result in depression. So what they're saying is there's a lot of other factors we didn't account for. Some of them are legitimate questions to ask. What was their financial situation of the participants? Were they wealthy or were they poor? Were they depressed because they don't have enough money to buy food for their kids? Those sorts of things were not asked. And so they note that that was a limitation of the study. In this study, based on questionnaire data from a well-defined agricultural cohort, high cumulative exposures in the absence of any high pesticide exposure events or pesticide poisonings, as well as a history of either pesticide exposure events or physician-diagnosed pesticide poisoning, was significantly associated with physician-diagnosed depression. The pattern was similar in separate analysis for Iowa and North Carolina. These results suggest that pesticide exposure may contribute to depression in farmer applicators and emphasize the importance of minimizing pesticide exposure. And I will say that I'm glad they make a note of the limitations, because the first thing people are going to start wanting to shoot holes in, did they account for this and did they account for that? No, they can't account for everything, okay? The survey would be so exhaustive, it would take an eternity to actually fill out. But they make a point that the study didn't account for some of these things and that they could have influenced it. However, within the confines of the study, which is robust, it's a robust study, there seems to be a pretty clear association between the use of some pesticides and clinically diagnosed depression, particularly organochlorines and organophosphates. So please use all the personal protective equipment that the label requires, and potentially even a little bit more. But don't add so much more that you're actually the inclusion of all that PPE actually results in harm. Like I mentioned, you could actually result in overheating yourself, particularly in the middle of the summer. That would be more harmful than reducing the PPE to the limit of the law and applying the pesticides that way. Okay. On Thursday night this week, we're going to be going over the bias against disconfirming evidence, which I've found to be very insightful. Very clearly shows that whenever you're presented with information that refutes your position, a lot of people are initially resistant. That can't be, and they want to fight it. They want to argue it and want to fight it when the evidence is pretty clear that it refutes your position. So there is a bias against that information. There's oftentimes even a bias in the scientific community when you're reviewing papers that, this isn't what I'm used to. I didn't see that. I don't know what that is. And so there's a bias against accepting that as actually valid and so forth. And I've said this, I've used this example, I don't know how many times, but when Einstein started doing his stuff in the 1918, 17, 16 time frame or whatever, right? The entire physics community, essentially in the entire world, didn't believe him. He was saying that, gravity can bend time and space, and everybody said you're crazy because the community was biased against the information, the evidence that was disconfirming the existing model of physics. And it was genius because Einstein said, well, if I'm right, then during this eclipse, which I think was in 1918 or 1919, you should be able to see this star behind the sun during the eclipse exactly at this point. And if you don't see it at that point, then I'm wrong and you're right. And the bias was so strong that even when the data came back, there was a little bit of an odd thing going on because there was a war going on in the country where there was an eclipse, and then they had to wait to another one. There was a lot of stuff going on. But the data first came in, and the data was a little bit. It wasn't clear that Einstein was right on the first eclipse, but clearly the data was there. It's like, well, maybe there's something going on here. Even then, the physicists still disagreed with Einstein. And it wasn't until later where the next eclipse happened where everybody's like, okay, you're right. That's when it became world renowned and famous because the physicists had to acknowledge that they were wrong and Einstein was right. Well, the resistance came from a bias against disconfirming evidence. It exists very, very much so in the scientific community as well as in the non-scientific community. Good morning, Transition Zone Guy 7B. He says, good morning, Dr. Shaddox. This is very good information. These are activities that we minimize that could result with long-term negative repercussions. I'll be more than thoughtful about future apps. Yeah. I mean, I just want to make sure that we're clear that I use pesticides. I apply pre-emergent herbicides. Occasionally, I apply some post-emergent herbicides. Occasionally, I mean, I'll apply glufosinate and glyphosate occasionally. Those are post, obviously. But I don't do a lot of pesticide applications like a normal applicator would do, or a normal golf course would, or a farmer would. I don't do that. But I do probably between 2 and maybe 4 times a year. I might be doing something like that. But I always have rubber boots on and gloves on, and I mean, it's the whole shebang. I mean, regardless of whether or not the product is extremely harmful or concerning or not. And so the take-home message is, there's repercussions that can occur that you might not necessarily consider as like, I was poisoned or I had exposure to this, but there can be long-term consequences such as clinically diagnosed depression. Okay, guys? So please wear your PPE, even if you don't like it. It's too hot, or I don't have a glove, or, my boot doesn't strap on. It feels funny when I'm walking in. Just wear it. You're better off. Okay, guys, I'll be back on Thursday night for the public show. And then next week, I have one morning show on Monday for the members only. And then Tuesday night of next week will be the last show of May, which will go into some of my personal challenges and potentially some revelation that might be communicated. Something that only my wife and my therapist are aware of. So look for that on not this coming Tuesday, but the following Tuesday night. Thanks, guys. See ya.